September 19, 1944. The transport truck rattled along a dirt road that seemed to stretch into infinity, carrying its cargo of bewildered German women deeper into the heart of Wyoming. 23-year-old Margaretha Schultz pressed her face against the canvas covering, catching glimpses of a landscape so vast it made her stomach turn. She had grown up in the narrow streets of Munich, where buildings pressed close together and the sky appeared in neat squares between rooftops. This place had no boundaries, no edges, no end. The prairie rolled out in every direction like an ocean frozen in golden waves, and somewhere in that emptiness, she and her fellow prisoners were being swallowed whole. The women had been captured 3 months earlier in France, serving as communications specialists and administrative personnel for the Wehrmacht. They had expected to be sent to a traditional prisoner of war camp on the American East Coast, perhaps near other German prisoners where they might maintain some connection to their former lives. Instead, they had been loaded onto trains that carried them west for days, through landscapes that grew progressively more foreign and intimidating. Now, as the truck slowed and turned through a gate marked only by 2 weathered posts, Margaretha felt the last familiar thing slip away behind her. The ranch compound appeared suddenly, rising from the prairie like a mirage. Several long wooden barracks stood in neat rows, surrounded by endless fencing that divided the grassland into geometric patterns. But it was the men waiting near the main building that made every woman in the truck fall silent. They stood with a stillness that seemed carved from the landscape itself, wearing wide-brimmed hats that shadowed their faces and boots that added inches to already imposing frames. These were not the American soldiers the women had encountered before, not the young infantry boys with their uncertain eyes and citified softness. These men carried themselves with a different kind of authority, one that came from wrestling cattle and surviving winters that could kill the unprepared. Sergeant Frank Holloway, the ranch foreman assigned to oversee the prisoner program, watched the truck come to a stop with carefully controlled expression. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broadened by 30 years of ranch work, he cut an intimidating figure even among his fellow cowboys. He had argued against bringing German prisoners to the Triple Creek Ranch, convinced that foreign women would be useless for the hard labor required to keep a working cattle operation running during wartime. But the War Department had been insistent. With most able-bodied men overseas fighting, ranches across the West were desperate for workers. Prisoner labor was the solution Washington had decided upon, and Holloway's objections had been overruled. The truck's canvas flap opened, and the German women began climbing down, their movements stiff from days of travel. They wore the remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms, now dusty and wrinkled, and their eyes reflected a mixture of exhaustion, defiance, and something Holloway recognized immediately as fear. Not fear of him or his men, but fear of this place, of this overwhelming landscape that reduced human beings to insignificant specks beneath an endless sky. The first meeting between captors and captives happened in silence that stretched uncomfortably across the dusty compound. Margaretha stood at attention with her fellow prisoners, maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into them during their service. 19 women in total, ranging in age from 18 to 32, all trying desperately to appear stronger and more capable than they felt. Across from them, 8 ranch hands studied the new arrivals, with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. Sergeant Holloway stepped forward, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each measured step. He held a clipboard that contained official documents about prisoner protocols and work assignments, but he barely glanced at it. Instead, he surveyed the women with the same assessing gaze he used when evaluating livestock at auction. These were not soldiers in any meaningful sense, he thought. They were clerks and radio operators who had probably never worked a full day of manual labor in their lives. How exactly was he supposed to run a cattle ranch with secretaries? He began speaking in clear, deliberate English, knowing that most of the women would struggle to understand. The rules were straightforward. Wake at 5 each morning, work assignments would be posted daily, no fraternization with ranch staff beyond what was necessary for work duties. Meals would be taken separately, lights out at 9 in the evening. Escape attempts would be met with severe consequences, though he suspected none of these women would last a day in the wilderness that surrounded them for hundreds of miles in every direction. Margaretha caught perhaps half of what he said, her limited English failing her at crucial moments. But the tone communicated everything the words might have missed. They were not welcome here. They were a burden, an inconvenience forced upon men who had neither the time nor the patience for managing foreign prisoners. She translated quietly for the women who spoke no English at all, watching their faces fall as they realized the hardship that awaited them. Behind Holloway, a younger ranch hand named Thomas Wheeler shifted his weight uncomfortably. At 28, he was one of the few men not yet drafted due to a childhood injury that had left him with a barely noticeable limp. He studied the German women with more curiosity than contempt, noting how some of them were barely older than his own sister back in Colorado. They looked exhausted, displaced, and utterly unprepared for ranch life. Something about their obvious vulnerability made him uneasy, though he would never say so in front of Holloway. The sergeant concluded his speech by pointing toward the barracks that would serve as their housing. The building was basic but functional, with rows of narrow beds and a wood stove for heat. It was more shelter than many prisoners received, though it would feel like a prison nonetheless. As the women filed toward their new quarters, Margaretha caught one last glimpse of the endless prairie beyond the fence. She had never felt so far from home, so completely swallowed by a world she did not understand. The first week passed in a blur of physical exhaustion that left Margaretha questioning whether she would survive to see the second. Wake-up came before dawn, when darkness still pressed against the barracks windows and the September air carried a bite that promised brutal winters ahead. The women stumbled from their beds, muscles screaming from the previous day's labor, and dressed quickly in the work clothes that had been issued to them. Heavy canvas trousers, rough cotton shirts, and boots that raised blisters on feet accustomed to more delicate footwear. The work assignments were merciless. Mending miles of fence line under the scorching Sunday, hauling feed bags that weighed nearly as much as some of the smaller women, mucking out stables that housed horses larger than anything they had seen in Germany. Every task revealed how utterly unprepared they were for this life. Hands that had operated radio equipment and typed correspondence now bled from wire cuts and developed calluses that cracked painfully in the dry air. Backs that had never bent to manual labor cramped and spasmed with each new day's demands. The cowboys watched with barely concealed contempt. Margaretha could feel their eyes following the prisoners as they struggled with tasks that ranch hands accomplished with casual efficiency. When the women failed to understand shouted instructions in English, the men grew frustrated, repeating themselves louder as if volume could overcome the language barrier. When the prisoners worked too slowly, the cowboys simply took over, completing in minutes what had taken the women hours, their actions a clear statement about the worthlessness of this foreign labor. Communication became a study in gesture and demonstration. Thomas Wheeler proved to be the most patient, showing rather than telling, moving slowly enough that the women could observe and learn. But even his kindness had limits when deadlines needed meeting, and cattle required attention that could not wait for translation. The ranch operated on schedules dictated by animals and weather, not by the learning curve of German prisoners. Meals were taken in separate buildings, maintaining the strict division between prisoners and staff. The women ate in silence, too tired for conversation, shoveling down food that tasted like nothing because exhaustion had dulled all their senses. Some cried quietly into their plates, tears mixing with stew that at least provided the calories their bodies desperately needed. Others simply stared at nothing, their minds retreating to memories of home, of lives that now seemed impossibly distant. At night, Margaretha lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of women weeping or praying in whispered German. Outside, the prairie wind howled against the barracks with a loneliness that matched their own. She thought about her mother in Munich, wondering if she even knew where her daughter had ended up. She thought about the communications equipment she had once operated with such pride, believing she was serving her country honorably. Now her hands were ruined, her body broken, and her spirit crushed beneath the weight of this vast, indifferent landscape that seemed designed to remind her how small and insignificant she truly was. The breaking point came on the 8th day when 20-year-old Elsa Bergman collapsed while hauling water buckets from the well to the livestock troughs. She simply crumpled in the dust, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion, dehydration, and the altitude that made every breath feel insufficient. The bucket she had been carrying tipped over, precious water spilling into the thirsty earth as she lay motionless beneath the midday sunday. Thomas Wheeler saw it happen from across the compound. He dropped the saddle he had been repairing and ran toward the fallen woman, his boots pounding against the hard-packed ground. Holloway shouted something behind him, likely a warning about fraternization protocols, but Thomas ignored it. He had watched these women struggle for over a week now, pushing themselves beyond reasonable limits, and something about seeing this girl collapse triggered memories of his younger sister, who had once worked herself sick, trying to prove she was strong enough to help on their family ranch. He knelt beside Elsa, gently turning her onto her back. Her face was flushed with heat, her lips cracked and bleeding from the dry air. Thomas called out in English for someone to bring water, then realized his mistake and simply gestured urgently to Margaretha, who had rushed over from the fence line where she had been working. She understood immediately, running for the well while Thomas carefully lifted Elsa's head onto his knee, using his body to shade her face from the relentless Sunday. When Margaretha returned with a full bucket and a ladle, Thomas took it from her with a brief nod. He lifted the water to Elsa's lips slowly, letting just drops pass through at first, knowing that too much too fast could make her sick. The girl's eyelids fluttered, consciousness returning gradually as the water revived her. Thomas spoke softly in English, words she could not understand but that carried a tone of reassurance that transcended language. "Easy now. You're all right. Just breathe." Margaretha watched this exchange with something approaching shock. For 8 days these men had treated them with cold efficiency at best, contempt at worst. Yet here was this cowboy, this enormous man with hands that could probably snap a person in half, cradling Elsa with surprising gentleness and genuine concern etched across his weathered face. When Elsa finally opened her eyes fully, Thomas helped her sit up slowly, keeping one steadying hand on her shoulder until he was certain she would not collapse again. Holloway arrived then, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. He looked at the spilled water, at the girl still too weak to stand, at Thomas kneeling in the dust beside a German prisoner. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Holloway did something unexpected. He turned to one of the other ranch hands and ordered him to take over Elsa's assignment for the rest of the day. The girl was to rest in the shade, drink water regularly, and return to work only when the doctor cleared her. It was a small mercy, but it was mercy nonetheless. October brought the first real test of survival to the Triple Creek Ranch. The weather had been growing steadily colder, morning frost coating the prairie grass with silver crystals that melted slowly under the weak autumn Sunday. The German women had been issued warmer clothing, heavy coats that smelled of mothballs and previous owners, but nothing had prepared them for what the old-timers called an early-season blizzard. It came without warning on the afternoon of October 12th. Margaretha had been working with 3 other women repairing a section of fence nearly 2 miles from the main compound when the sky suddenly darkened from pale blue to an ominous gray-green. The temperature dropped so quickly she could see her breath materializing in front of her face within minutes. Thomas Wheeler, who had been supervising their work from horseback, immediately recognized the danger. He had seen storms like this before, knew how quickly they could turn deadly on the open prairie. He shouted instructions that the women barely understood, gesturing urgently toward an old line shack visible in the distance. It was a small shelter used by cowboys during cattle drives, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was the only protection within reach. The wind hit them before they covered half the distance, nearly knocking the smaller women off their feet. Snow began falling in thick, blinding sheets that erased the landscape within seconds. Margaretha felt Thomas grab her arm, his grip firm but not painful, pulling her forward when she stumbled. He had dismounted and was leading his horse, while physically guiding the women towards safety, his size and strength, the only thing keeping them moving in the right direction. They tumbled through the door of the line shack just as the full fury of the storm descended. Thomas slammed the door shut against wind that howled like something alive and hungry. Inside, the 5 of them stood gasping in the sudden dimness, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The shack was perhaps 12 feet square, containing a small wood stove, a single cot with a thin mattress, and some basic supplies stored in wooden crates. Thomas immediately set about building a fire in the stove, his movements efficient, despite hands that had begun to shake from cold. The women huddled together near the stove as warmth slowly filled the tiny space. Outside, the wind screamed and snow piled against the walls with terrifying speed. Thomas checked the supplies and found enough firewood to last perhaps 2 days if they were careful, along with some preserved food and a few wool blankets. He spoke slowly in English, trying to explain their situation. They were trapped until the storm passed. The ranch would send search parties when it was safe, but that might not be for days. They would need to ration everything carefully and stay close to the stove. Margaretha translated for the others, watching fear register on their faces. They were locked in a 12-foot prison with one of their captors, completely dependent on his knowledge and skills for survival. The first night in the line shack passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the storm's relentless assault on the walls. Thomas had given the women the single cot and the blankets, insisting through gestures that they share the limited warmth. He settled himself on the floor near the stove, feeding it small pieces of wood throughout the night to maintain heat without depleting their supply too quickly. Margaretha watched him from the cot, studying this man who had become their unwilling protector. He never complained about the hard floor or the cold that seeped through the gaps in the walls. He simply did what needed doing with the same quiet efficiency she had observed in all his work. Morning brought no relief. The storm continued with undiminished fury, snow now piled nearly 3 feet high against the door. Thomas rationed out small portions of dried meat and hardtack biscuits, apologizing in English for the meager meal. One of the younger women, Greta Hoffman, surprised everyone by pulling out a small harmonica she had somehow managed to keep hidden since her capture. She played softly, a German folk song that spoke of home and hearth, and winters survived together. Thomas listened without understanding the words, but clearly recognizing the emotion behind them. As the second day wore on, the forced proximity began breaking down barriers that protocol had carefully maintained. Thomas attempted to teach the women basic English words, pointing to objects in the shack and speaking slowly. Stove, wood, door, snow. The women repeated after him, their accents thick but their attention genuine. In turn, Margaretha taught him German equivalents, watching surprise register on his weathered face when he discovered that some words sounded similar between their languages. This small exchange of vocabulary became a bridge across the divide of nationality and circumstance. By the third day, when the storm finally began to diminish, something fundamental had shifted between them. Thomas had shared his limited food equally, never taking more than his fair portion despite being twice the size of any woman present. He had kept the fire burning through nights when exhaustion made his eyes droop, but his hands continued their steady work. He had treated them not as enemies or prisoners, but simply as human beings who needed help surviving. The women had responded by contributing what they could, taking turns monitoring the fire so he could sleep, sharing the small comforts they possessed. When the rescue party from the ranch finally arrived on the 4th morning, led by Holloway on horseback, they found the 5 survivors tired and hungry, but alive. Holloway studied the scene with sharp eyes, noting the careful rationing of supplies, the efficiently maintained fire, and something less tangible but equally visible. The German women stood close to Thomas rather than away from him, and when Margaretha thanked him in her careful English, the gratitude in her voice carried weight that transcended simple politeness. Thomas simply nodded, gathered his gear, and prepared for the ride back to the compound. November brought the first letters from Germany, distributed by the International Red Cross to prisoner of war camps across America. The German women gathered in their barracks as Captain James Mitchell, the military liaison officer, handed out the thin envelopes that had traveled across an ocean and a continent to reach this remote Wyoming ranch. Some women received multiple letters. Others received none at all. Margarita's hands trembled as she accepted 2 envelopes, recognizing her mother's handwriting on one and her younger sister's on the other. She waited until evening to open them, needing privacy for whatever news they contained. Sitting on her narrow bed with a kerosene lamp casting flickering shadows across the page, she carefully unfolded the first letter. Her mother's words were brief, constrained by censorship and perhaps by emotions too large for paper to hold. Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly. Their neighborhood no longer existed. Her father had been killed in an air raid in July. Her mother was living with relatives in the countryside, surviving on rations that grew smaller each month. The letter ended with a simple plea. "Stay safe, my daughter. Stay alive. There is nothing left here for you to come home to." The second letter from her sister contained even worse news. She had been conscripted for factory work in Berlin, producing ammunition in underground facilities that operated around the clock. The conditions were brutal, the food scarce, and the bombing constant. But it was her sister's final paragraph that made Margarita's breath catch in her throat. She wrote about rumors spreading through the workers, whispered stories about camps in the East where terrible things were happening to Jewish families and other undesirables. She wrote about soldiers returning from the front with haunted eyes who spoke of atrocities they had witnessed. She wrote, "Margarita, I fear we have been serving something far more evil than we ever understood." Around the barracks, other women were reading their own letters, and similar scenes were unfolding. Elsa Bergman learned that her entire family had perished when their apartment building collapsed during a bombing raid. Greta Hoffman discovered that her fiancé had been killed on the Eastern Front 6 months earlier, and no one had been able to notify her. Anna Dietz received no letters at all, which meant either her family could not be located or there was no family left to write. The crying started quietly but soon filled the barracks with a sound of collective grief that was almost unbearable. These women had been holding themselves together through weeks of backbreaking labor and cultural isolation, maintaining their dignity and composure even in captivity. But the letters shattered whatever walls they had built around their emotions. They wept for families destroyed, for homes that no longer existed, for a country that was burning while they remained trapped on the other side of the world, powerless to help or even to witness its destruction. Thomas Wheeler, making his evening rounds to check the perimeter, heard the crying from outside the barracks. He stood in the darkness for a long moment, listening to a grief that needed no translation. The morning after the letters arrived, the German women worked in silence that felt different from their earlier days of exhaustion and resentment. This was the silence of mourning, of souls hollowed out by loss. Margarita moved through her tasks mechanically, her body present, but her mind thousands of miles away in the ruins of Hamburg. The other women moved the same way, like ghosts inhabiting their own bodies. Thomas noticed immediately. He had been assigned to supervise a group of 5 women repairing a section of barn roof damaged by the recent storm. Normally, even with the language barrier, there would be some communication, some signs of life. Today they simply climbed the ladder and began working with expressions that suggested they no longer cared whether they fell. It was that dangerous indifference that finally made him speak. He climbed up beside Margarita and sat on the roof beam, gesturing for her to stop working and rest for a moment. She looked at him with eyes that held such emptiness it made his chest tighten. He struggled to find words, knowing his limited German would fail him, but finally he simply said in English what was in his heart. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for whatever you learned yesterday. I'm sorry for all of it." Margarita understood enough to grasp his meaning. Something in his tone, in the genuine sympathy on his weathered face, broke through the numbness that had encased her since reading her mother's letter. She found herself speaking in German, words tumbling out in a rush, not caring that he could not understand. She told him about her father's death, about her sister's fears, about a home that no longer existed. She told him about the rumors of camps and atrocities, about serving a cause she had believed was righteous, only to discover it might have been monstrous. Thomas listened without interrupting, letting her pour out words he could not comprehend, but whose emotion he understood perfectly. When she finally fell silent, tears streaming down her face, he did something that violated every protocol about prisoner-guard relationships. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded photograph of a young man in an American uniform. "His brother," he said quietly, "killed at Normandy in June, 22 years old." He showed her another photograph, this one of an older couple standing in front of a small ranch house. "My parents," he explained in simple English, speaking slowly so she might understand, "lost the ranch last year. Dust Bowl took everything. Father died of pneumonia last winter because we couldn't afford a doctor. Mother lives with my sister in Colorado now, barely getting by." The revelation hung between them on that roof beneath the vast Wyoming sky. Two people from enemy nations, both carrying losses too heavy for words, recognizing in each other a shared understanding of grief. Thomas carefully returned the photographs to his pocket, then pulled out a clean handkerchief and offered it to Margarethe. She accepted it with a quiet thank you, one of the few English phrases she had mastered. December arrived with temperatures that dropped below zero and transformed the prairie into a landscape of crystalline beauty and brutal danger. The German women had been at the Triple Creek Ranch for 3 months now, and something remarkable had occurred. They had stopped being simply prisoners performing mandated labor and had become, in subtle but undeniable ways, part of the ranch's working crew. Their hands had toughened, their bodies had adapted, and their skills had developed to the point where they could handle many tasks without constant supervision. Margarethe had discovered an unexpected talent for working with horses. The massive animals that had terrified her upon arrival now responded to her calm, patient handling. Thomas had noticed this aptitude and began teaching her more advanced techniques, showing her how to read a horse's body language, how to earn trust through consistency and gentleness. Their communication had evolved beyond simple words into something more intuitive, a shared language of gesture and demonstration that worked surprisingly well. Greta Hoffman had become indispensable in the ranch's mechanical operations. She possessed an intuitive understanding of engines and equipment that impressed even Holloway, who reluctantly admitted that the girl could diagnose problems faster than most of his experienced hands. She spent her days in the workshop, her hands perpetually stained with grease, repairing tractors and generators that kept the ranch functioning through the harsh winter. Elsa Bergman, who had collapsed from exhaustion in those first terrible weeks, had found her place working alongside the ranch cook, Maria Santos. Maria, a Mexican-American woman who had worked at Triple Creek for 15 years, spoke limited English herself and seemed to appreciate having help from someone who understood the challenges of language barriers. Together they prepared meals that fed 24 people 3 times daily, and Elsa's German recipes occasionally appeared alongside Maria's traditional dishes, creating unexpected cultural fusion on Wyoming plates. The barriers between prisoners and ranch staff had eroded so gradually that no one could point to the exact moment when the shift occurred. Meals were still technically taken separately, but conversations now happened across the divide. Cowboys taught German words to amuse themselves during long winter evenings, while the women practiced English phrases with increasing confidence. Someone had produced a checkerboard, and impromptu tournaments developed, with Thomas and Margarethe emerging as the most evenly matched competitors. But it was the Christmas preparations that revealed how completely the dynamic had transformed. When Holloway announced that the ranch would observe a modest holiday celebration, the German women volunteered to help with decorations. Greta fashioned ornaments from scrap metal in the workshop. Elsa baked traditional German cookies using carefully hoarded ingredients. Margarethe taught the ranch hands a German carol, their pronunciation terrible but their enthusiasm genuine. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside and firelight filled the main hall, 2 groups who had begun as enemies sat together sharing food, music, and stories. Thomas raised a cup of coffee and a toast, his English simple but his meaning clear, to making it through together. Margarethe translated for those who needed it, then added her own words, to finding unexpected friends in unexpected places. May 8, 1945 arrived at the Triple Creek Ranch, not with celebration, but with profound uncertainty. The radio in Holloway's office crackled with news that the war in Europe had officially ended. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Victory in Europe Day had come, and across America, people flooded into streets to celebrate the defeat of the Nazi regime. But in the small compound outside the main ranch house, the 19 German women received the news in heavy silence. Margarita stood with the others in the barracks as Captain Mitchell read the official announcement. The war was over. Germany had been defeated. Repatriation procedures would begin within weeks for all German prisoners of war held on American soil. They would be processed, transported to the East Coast, and shipped back to their homeland. The captain's voice remained professionally neutral, but his eyes betrayed discomfort as he delivered news that should have brought joy, but instead filled the room with dread. After he left, the women sat on their beds without speaking. Greta was the first to break the silence, her voice small and uncertain. "What are we returning to?" The question hung in the air because they all knew the answer. Letters from Germany had painted increasingly desperate pictures throughout the winter. Cities reduced to rubble. Infrastructure destroyed. Millions dead or displaced. The economy collapsed. Food scarce. And perhaps worst of all, the revelation of concentration camps and systematic atrocities had shattered any remaining illusions about the regime they had served. Elsa spoke next, her words barely above a whisper. "I have no family left. No home. Nothing. What am I going back for?" Similar sentiments rippled through the group. More than half the women had lost every family member they had known. Their homes existed only in memory, reduced to dust and ash by years of bombing. The Germany they remembered was gone, replaced by something broken and ashamed. But there was another reason for their reluctance, one that was harder to articulate. Over the past 8 months, something unexpected had happened at this remote Wyoming ranch. They had found purpose in their work, dignity in their labor, and acceptance from people who should have been their enemies. The Cowboys who had initially viewed them with contempt now treated them as colleagues. Thomas Wheeler, who had saved them during the blizzard and taught them countless skills, had become something approaching a friend. Even Holloway, stern and unbending at first, had softened enough to acknowledge their contributions. Margarita thought about the horses she had learned to train, the English she had mastered, the community that had formed in this unlikely place. She thought about her conversations with Thomas on the roof of the barn, how they had learned to communicate across the barriers of language and nationality. She thought about feeling useful, valued, and safe for the first time since the war began. That night, she wrote in her diary a question that would change everything. If home is where you are valued and belong, then where is home now? Germany or here? The meeting happened 3 days after the surrender announcement, held in the ranch's main office where important decisions were traditionally made. Captain Mitchell had returned from his regional headquarters with updated repatriation schedules and transportation details. He expected a routine briefing, perhaps some questions about logistics, maybe a few tears from homesick prisoners eager to return despite the devastation awaiting them. What he did not expect was what Margarita Schultz proposed. She had been chosen by the others to serve as their spokesperson, her English now fluent enough to handle complex conversations. She stood before Captain Mitchell, Sergeant Holloway, and 2 other military officials, with her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. Behind her, 7 other German women stood in silent support. "Captain Mitchell," she began, her accent still noticeable but her words clear, "we have discussed among ourselves the repatriation order. Some of us, we wish to make an unusual request." The captain gestured for her to continue, curiosity replacing his earlier businesslike expression. Margarita took a deep breath and spoke words that would soon make headlines across the country. 8 of us wish to request permission to remain in the United States rather than return to Germany. We understand this is unprecedented. We understand we are prisoners of war, but we are asking if there is any legal mechanism that would allow us to stay. The silence that followed was absolute. Captain Mitchell stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he could not comprehend. Holloway's weathered face registered shock for the first time since the women had arrived. One of the other officials actually laughed, a short bark of disbelief that died quickly when he realized Margaretha was completely serious. Captain Mitchell found his voice first. "Miss Schulz, I'm not sure you understand what you're asking. You're prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires your repatriation. We cannot simply allow enemy nationals to remain on American soil because they prefer it here." Margaretha had anticipated this response. "With respect, Captain, we are not asking for special treatment. We are asking if we can apply for displaced persons status. We have no homes to return to, no families. Many of our cities no longer exist. We have job skills developed here. We have potential sponsors willing to vouch for us. We are asking for the chance to rebuild our lives in a country that has shown us more humanity than our own ever did." Behind her, Anna Dietz spoke up in heavily accented English. "Captain, Germany is defeated and destroyed. But we are not destroyed. We want to contribute, to work, to become better than what we were. Is this not the American way? To give people second chances?" The question hung in the air, challenging assumptions about justice, redemption, and what nations owe to former enemies. Captain Mitchell closed his folder slowly, realizing this situation was far beyond his authority to resolve. "I'll need to contact Washington," he said finally. "This decision goes well above my rank." News of the German women's request spread through the ranch within hours and through the surrounding community within days. Reactions varied wildly. Some local residents were outraged at the idea of Nazi prisoners being allowed to stay on American soil when so many American boys had died fighting Germany. Others, particularly those who had interacted with the women through church outreach programs or community events, expressed support for their petition. But the most unexpected advocates came from the men who had guarded them. Thomas Wheeler was the first to act. When Captain Mitchell mentioned that the women would need sponsors and character references if their petition had any chance of approval, Thomas immediately volunteered. He spent an entire evening composing a letter that he rewrote 4 times before he felt it adequately expressed what he wanted to say. His handwriting was rough, his spelling occasionally uncertain, but his sincerity was unmistakable. He wrote about the blizzard that had trapped them together, about watching Margaretha transform from a terrified prisoner into a skilled horsewoman, about witnessing genuine remorse and transformation over 8 months of daily interaction. Holloway's response was more surprising. The ranch foreman had been the most skeptical about the prisoner program from the beginning, the most rigid about maintaining proper boundaries between captors and captives. Yet he too picked up a pen and wrote to military authorities. His letter was characteristically blunt. "When these women arrived, I thought they would be useless. I was wrong. They work harder than most men I've employed. They've learned skills that make them valuable contributors to this operation. More importantly, they've shown character. Sending them back to nothing seems like a waste of human potential, and I don't believe in waste." Maria Santos, the ranch cook, wrote in a mixture of English and Spanish about Elsa Bergman's dedication and kindness in the kitchen. Dr. Franklin Hayes, who served the ranch and surrounding community, wrote about treating the women for various injuries and illnesses, noting their resilience and their genuine gratitude for medical care. Even ranch hands who had initially grumbled about babysitting German prisoners added their voices to the growing chorus of support. But it was the local community response that proved most powerful. Mrs. Dorothy Brennan, who taught at the small school in the nearest town, organized a petition signed by over 200 residents. Reverend Samuel Clark of the Methodist Church wrote an impassioned letter about redemption and Christian charity. The owner of the general store noted that the German women who occasionally came to town with guards were always polite, always paid fairly, and always treated his staff with respect. Letters began arriving at the War Department in Washington from Wyoming, each one testifying to the character and transformation of 8 German women who had somehow earned the support of the very people who should have hated them most. Captain Mitchell compiled these testimonials into an official report, adding his own observation that he had never witnessed such a genuine outpouring of community support for former enemy prisoners. The decision now rested with officials in Washington who had never met these women and knew them only as files and reports. The waiting period stretched into June, with no word from Washington. The 8 women who had requested to stay existed in a strange limbo, continuing their daily work, while 11 of their compatriots prepared for repatriation. The division created tension that had not existed before, not from anger or resentment, but from the simple fact that they were choosing different futures. Those returning to Germany viewed those staying as abandoning their homeland in its darkest hour. Those staying viewed those returning as braver for facing the devastation rather than escaping it. Margaretha found herself caught between these perspectives, questioning her decision during long, sleepless nights. Was she being selfish by choosing to stay in safety while Germany suffered? Or was she being practical by recognizing that she had nothing to offer a country that no longer existed as she had known it? She thought about her mother's letter, the plea to stay alive because there was nothing left to come home to. But she also thought about her sister in Berlin, surviving in ammunition factories, needing all the help Germany could get to rebuild. She sought out Thomas one evening, finding him in the stable grooming one of the horses she had learned to train. He looked up as she approached, immediately sensing her troubled state. "Having doubts?" he asked in simple English he knew she would understand. She nodded, struggling to find words in either language to express the complexity of her feelings. He set down the brush and leaned against the stable wall, giving her his full attention. In halting English mixed with German words when vocabulary failed her, she explained her internal conflict. Thomas listened without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "My brother died in France," he said slowly, "fighting against your country. When I first heard about you all coming here, I was angry. Thought it was wrong to treat enemy prisoners well when Americans were still dying overseas. But then, I met you, worked beside you, watched you cry over letters from home, saw you become someone different than who you were." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You staying here, that's not betraying Germany. That's choosing to live a life that honors what's good instead of what was evil. Germany needs people who can build something better, but maybe you can do that better from here by being an example of what's possible when people change." Margaretha felt tears building but forced them back. "What if Washington says no? What if they send us back anyway?" Thomas shrugged with a pragmatism born of ranch life where outcomes were often beyond human control. "Then you'll face that when it comes. But you made the choice that felt right to you. That's all anyone can do." The conversation helped, but it did not resolve her doubts completely. Nothing could, because there was no perfect answer, no choice without cost. She was suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, hoping that somehow she might build a bridge between them. June 22, 1945 dawned clear and warm, the kind of Wyoming morning where the sky stretched forever in shades of blue that seemed impossible. It was the day chosen for repatriation, when the 11 German women who had decided to return home would leave the Triple Creek Ranch for the last time. 2 military trucks waited in the compound, engines idling, ready to transport them to the train station in Cheyenne and begin their long journey back across the Atlantic. The farewells began at dawn. Greta Hoffman, who was staying, embraced her friend Liesl Klein, who was returning to search for any surviving relatives in Dresden. They had worked side by side since their capture in France, shared a bunk bed throughout their imprisonment, and now faced separation that might last forever. "Write to me," Greta whispered in German. "Tell me what you find there. Tell me if there's anything left worth returning to." Liesl nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Elsa Bergman said goodbye to the women who had helped her survive those first brutal weeks. She gave each one a small package of cookies she had baked, wrapped carefully in brown paper, tied with string saved from supply deliveries. It was all she had to offer, these humble gifts that represented hours of work and the skills she had learned in Maria's kitchen. The women accepted them with the solemnity of people receiving sacred objects, knowing they represented more than simple food. Margaretha stood with Anna Dietz, both of them staying, watching their former companions prepare to board the trucks. She caught sight of Thomas across the compound, standing with other ranch hands who had gathered to witness the departure. Over the past weeks, something had developed between them that neither had named or fully acknowledged. It existed in shared glances, in conversations that lasted longer than necessary, in the way he always seemed to find reasons to work near wherever she was assigned. Now, with her future uncertain, neither of them knew what to do with these unspoken feelings. Captain Mitchell called for the departing women to board. They climbed into the truck slowly, taking last looks at the ranch that had been their home for 9 months. Holloway stood at attention, offering them a crisp salute that acknowledged their service and their dignity. It was a gesture of respect from a man who rarely showed emotion, and several women visibly struggled to maintain composure. As the trucks began to roll forward, hands waved from both sides. The German women called out farewells in their native language, their voices carrying across the compound. The ranch staff responded with their own goodbyes, some in English, some attempting German phrases they had learned. Thomas raised his hand in a simple wave, his eyes finding Margaretha's across the distance. The trucks disappeared down the long drive, becoming smaller and smaller until they were just dust clouds on the horizon. Then even the dust settled, and they were gone. The 8 women who remained stood together in silence, feeling the weight of their choice settle around them like the vast Wyoming sky. The response from Washington arrived on July 3, 1945, one day before America celebrated its independence. Captain Mitchell called the 8 remaining German women to Holloway's office, his expression carefully neutral in a way that revealed nothing about the contents of the official telegram he held. Margarita's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears as she stood with the others, waiting for words that would determine the course of their lives. "The War Department," Captain Mitchell read slowly, "has reviewed the petition for displaced persons status submitted by 8 German nationals currently held at the Triple Creek Ranch facility in Wyoming. Given the unprecedented nature of this request and the extensive character testimonials provided by military personnel and civilian sponsors, approval has been granted under the following conditions. The women will be released from prisoner of war status effective immediately. They will be processed as displaced persons and granted temporary residency permits valid for 2 years. During this period, they must maintain steady employment, demonstrate good moral character, and report monthly to immigration authorities. After 2 years, they may apply for permanent residency status." The words took a moment to penetrate. Then Anna Dietz gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Greta Hoffman began crying, tears streaming down her face as relief overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. Margaretha simply stood frozen, unable to process that the impossible had somehow become possible. They were being allowed to stay. They were being given the second chance they had barely dared to hope for. Captain Mitchell continued reading the conditions and requirements, but Margaretha heard little of it over the rushing sound in her ears. When he finished, he set down the telegram and looked at them with something approaching warmth. "Ladies," he said, "I'll be honest. I didn't think Washington would approve this. But you've earned something rare. You've earned the support of people who had every reason to hate you. Don't waste this opportunity." The transition from prisoners to free residents happened with surprising speed. The barracks that had been their prison became temporary housing until they could find permanent situations. Greta was hired officially by the ranch as a mechanic, the first woman to hold such a position at Triple Creek. Anna found employment at the local hospital, working under Dr. Hayes while studying for her nursing certification. Elsa continued working with Maria in the kitchen, now earning wages that she carefully saved with dreams of someday opening her own bakery. Margaretha accepted a position managing the ranch's breeding program, working directly with Thomas to train horses for sale to other ranches across Wyoming. The work was challenging and rewarding, requiring skills she had never imagined possessing when she first arrived as a terrified prisoner. More than that, it gave her purpose and a sense of belonging she had never experienced, even in Germany. On the evening of July 4th, the ranch held a celebration that included the 8 German women, not as prisoners or even as employees, but simply as members of the community. As fireworks lit up the Wyoming sky, Margaretha stood beside Thomas, watching colors bloom against the darkness. 25 years after 8 German women made the unprecedented choice to remain in the country that had captured them, Margaretha Wheeler stood in a pasture on the Triple Creek Ranch, watching her teenage daughter work with a young horse. The girl had inherited her mother's gift with animals and her father's patient determination, a perfect blending of two worlds that had once been enemies. Thomas stood beside Margaretha, his hair now gray but his frame still solid, his hand resting comfortably on her shoulder in the easy intimacy of a quarter-century of marriage. The ranch had prospered over the years, expanding its operations and earning a reputation for producing some of the finest horses in Wyoming. Margaretha had become a respected figure in ranching circles, her accent now barely noticeable, her expertise sought after by operations across the West. Few people who met her today would guess that she had arrived here as a prisoner of war, believing her life was over. The other women who had chosen to stay had built similarly remarkable lives. Greta Hoffman had eventually opened her own repair shop in town, becoming the first female business owner in the county and training dozens of mechanics over the years. Anna Dietz had earned her nursing degree and now ran the expanded hospital that served 3 counties. Elsa Bergman had indeed opened her bakery, which had become a beloved institution where German recipes mingled with American traditions. But perhaps more significantly, they had maintained connections with those who had returned to Germany. Letters crossed the Atlantic regularly, chronicling the parallel journeys of women who had faced the same choice but made different decisions. Liesl Klein had found distant relatives in what remained of Dresden and had dedicated her life to teaching, helping to educate a generation of Germans about the dangers of hatred and nationalism. Others had become social workers, nurses, and community organizers, contributing to Germany's reconstruction in ways both practical and spiritual. The story of the German women prisoners who had begged to stay had become something of a legend, written about in newspapers and studied by historians interested in the complexities of post-war reconciliation. But for Margaretha, it was simply her life, the path she had chosen when faced with an impossible decision. She had learned that home was not a place you were born, but a place you built through your choices and your contributions. She had discovered that redemption was possible when people were willing to see past uniforms and nationalities to recognize shared humanity. As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marguerite thought about that terrified young woman who had arrived here in 1944, believing she knew who she was and what the world contained. That woman had known nothing, but through hardship, kindness, loss, and unexpected grace, she had learned what truly mattered. Not the country you were born in, but the values you chose to live by. Not the mistakes of your past, but your commitment to building a better future. The prairie had swallowed her pride all those years ago. In return, it had given her a life worth living.